Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final installment in the series of Shiurim on Chametz. In this Shiur, we're going to be talking about the chemistry of Chametz, which is a little bit more nitty-gritty as opposed to the more philosophical concepts as we discussed in the previous Shiurim. But at the end of the Shiur, we're going to wrap everything up, all the four Shiurim together, and try and get a Musar Haskel, a bottom line from all of it together. So before we do that, there were two sources that I skipped over last week in last week's Shiur about the Chametz and the Mikdash. But they pertain to this week's Shiur, so I'm just going to repeat them quickly in the beginning. Source number 26. V'chol ha'mincha asher takrivu laHashem lo ta'aseh chametz ki chol seor v'chol dvash lo taktiru mimenu ishe laHashem. In the Beit HaMikdash, you're not allowed to bring chametz and dvash. Dvash is defined by Chazal as any mitikut pri, any sweetness from any fruit. So it can be date honey, it can be bee honey, anything that is sweet, basically. These are the two ingredients that you are not allowed to makriv on the mizbeach. You're not allowed to bring a korban on the mizbeach that has chametz in and that has dvash in. And Chazal give a number of reasons why this is not allowed. For example, the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchin, in source number 27, he explains that the reason that there's an isur of chametz and dvash on the mizbeach is because that was the minhag of their avodah zarah. When they used to bring korbanot on their mizbachot, they used to add sugar, sweetener, and they used to bring breads which were chametz. So in order to do 180 degrees opposite to what the of their kochavim do, we don't bring these things on the mizbeach. That is according to the Rambam. We're going to show a few more reasons why we don't bring it. We talked a little bit more about it in the previous Shiurim, why Dafka Chametz is a persona non grata in the Mikdash. For the most part, there are two exceptions that we talked about last week, but there are a number of reasons why. One is what the Rambam says, the other one is what we said last week, is that Chametz symbolizes the Yetzer Hara, and therefore we don't want the Yetzer Hara as much as possible in the Mikdash. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the chemistry of Chametz. Before we talk about the chemistry of Chametz, we need to define what Chametz is. The word Chametz is a unique word in Hebrew because it defies translation in any other language. It's impossible to adequately translate chametz into any other language. And it's even almost impossible to explain it, what it means, even in Hebrew. And we will soon see that. So the definition of chametz is if you take grains or flour from the grains of the 5 species, which is chita, seorah, kusmin, Shifon and Shibolet Shu'al. Wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. Those are called the Chameshet Minei Dagan. If you take either grains or you grind the grains into flour and you mix them with water, and this undergoes a certain process called chimutz, it becomes chametz. That is what is called chametz. How do you define chametz? That we need to look into the Mishnah. We talk about the definition of chametz by Chazal. Chazal give various characteristics of a dough that has become chametz. What are the external appearances of this dough? So the source number 34, the Mishnah in Masechet Psachim says, Ezehu siur, what is defined as seor? What is seor chametz? Karnei chagavim. It looks like the antenna of a grasshopper, like the little hair-like antenna of a grasshopper. Siduk shenit arbu stakav zu im ze beze. So one of the visual characteristics of a dough that has become chametz, according to the Mishnah, is that on the surface of the dough you see hair-like cracks which resemble the thickness of the cracks are similar to the antenna of a grasshopper. That's how thin they are. As the dough begins to rise, the crust of the dough stretches and hairline cracks form in the crust of the dough, and the Mishnah calls these karnei chagavim. That is the one opinion according to Rabbi Yehuda, Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. The other opinion, v'chachamim omrim, ezehu siur, kol shehichsifu panav. What does it mean, hichsifu panav? It means that if you look at the surface of the dough, it will have like a kind of a silvery sheen on it. It will have kind of a silvery appearance on the top of the dough. So in fact, it's a machloket in the Mishnah between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda, but it's not really a machloket because they are both characteristics of chimutz of two different types of dough. The first kind of a dough is a stiffer dough, where the dough has less water in it. It's a stiffer dough. When that dough starts to become chametz, the cracks form in the crust of the dough. That is the picture you see on the right. Karnei chagavim, interlocking cracks, hair-like cracks in the dough. That is the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. It's talking about a stiffer dough. The Chachamim opinion is talking about a dough which is more liquidy. If it's a more liquid batter, like a pancake batter, which is much more liquidy, after it becomes chametz, you're going to see a silvery sheen on the top of the surface of the liquid. And the reason we see the silvery sheen is because part of the fermentation process creates alcohol as a byproduct of the fermentation. And when you look at alcohol floating on top of water, it gives a kind of a silvery sheen. It reflects the light a little differently, and it looks a kind of a silvery covering the top of the liquid. So in fact, the Mishnah is talking about two different types of dough. There's not really a machloket between either Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. They're both talking about different types of dough, more liquid and less liquid. These are two visual cues that can give you an idea when dough has become chametz. If you look at a dough and you see either of these two characteristics, you know that the dough has become chametz. That is the yardstick that Chazal determine to decide whether dough has become chametz or not. However, there is a certain case that you do not see these characteristics. What happens if a dough becomes chametz but it doesn't display these telltale characteristics on the surface of the dough? This kind of a dough which doesn't demonstrate externally any characteristics is called in the Gemara, it's called a batzeg cheresh. Batzeg cheresh means deaf, dumb dough, a dough that can't communicate, basically. It can't tell you that it's become chametz, but it actually has become chametz internally. You just don't see it externally on the surface of the dough like described in the Mishnah. So how can you tell when a batzeg cheresh has become chametz? And the Gemara in Masechet Pesachim, source number 36, the Mishnah first, source number 35, batzeg cheresh im yesh kayotze bo sheichmitz harei ze asur. So what happens is, in order to determine whether this dough has become chametz or not, you have to have two doughs. One that shows the characteristics, and the other one, which is the batzeg cheresh, which doesn't show the characteristics. They are both needed at the same time, and they're placed next to each other. One shows the characteristics, and the other one doesn't. The one that doesn't is called the batzeg cheresh, but if you have one next to it which does, that is called the kayotzebo. A similar dough needed at the same starting point as this dough. If it demonstrates these characteristics, then you know that batzeg cheresh has become chametz. So the Gemara in source number 36 says, however, what happens if you don't have another dough to compare it with? Im en kayotzebo, what do? Mahu. Amar Rab Abahu, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, kedei sheyelech adam mimigdal nunia letveria, you, instead of determining it by comparing it with another dough, you determine a fixed time limit. And this time limit is the time that it takes for a man to walk from a place called Migdal Nunia to Tveria. And the distance from the two, one to the other, is the distance of a mil. A mil in the Gemara is approximately 1 kilometer. There's difference of opinions exactly how much a mil. It's approximately 1 kilometer. So the question is, why do they determine the measurement of a mil as the determining factor of determining chametz? Why do they use specifically that measurement? So the reason is when a person wants to do a mitzvah, for example, if you're on the road, you're traveling, and you want to eat lunch, but there's nowhere to wash your hands. You need to do nitty yadayim, and you don't have anywhere to wash hands. But you know that about half a kilometer back there was a gas station, and if you backtrack, you can go and back and wash hands. So the question is how far you have to go back to perform the mitzvah of netilat yadayim. What is considered acceptable interruption in your journey that you have to go back? So the Gemara says, "Hu de'eno chozer ha pachot mimil." If the distance that you have to backtrack is less than the distance of a mil, then you have to stop your journey, you have to go back, you have to perform the mitzvah, and then continue. However, if the distance is over a mil, if it's a mil or more, the halacha is that you do not have to go back, because the distance of a mil is considered a significant delay. It's a significant delay. It's the minimum amount of a significant delay. If it's something is significant, you don't disrupt your journey. But if it's less than a significant delay, then you have to interrupt and go back. So that's why Chazal determined the mil as the yardstick to determine a significant delay. As applied to the dough, if you talk about what is a significant delay in the dough, that you let the dough rest for a certain amount of time, what is the minimum of a significant rest, minimum delay? It's called the distance that it takes a man to walk a mil. And Chazal determined this time for a person to walk a mil. There's different opinions. One says that it's 18 minutes. One says it's 22 and a half minutes. The third opinion says it's 24 minutes. The most acceptable opinion that we go according today is the 18 minutes. In other words, halacha l'maaseh, if a person mixes a dough with water, from the second that you stop kneading the dough, actually that is a halacha, from the second that you stop kneading the dough, you have to begin a stopwatch. If 18 minutes have passed, even though that you don't see the telltale characteristics of the cracks or the silvery sheen on the top of the dough, you can't see anything on the dough is defined as chametz. That is the halachic definition of chametz. Okay. Now, that is the halacha on the one side. Let's talk a little bit about chemistry on the other side. I said that chametz is very difficult to define and translate into any other language because it's sort of an enigma. Because on the one hand, if you think of chametz as fermentation, what is chametz? Chametz is fermentation, where the dough rises and it becomes chametz, right? That's what everybody thinks. However, there is another kind of dough that can rise and ferment, but it's not considered chametz. What kind of a dough is that? If you take flour, which is not one of the 5 grains, for example, if you use rice flour or tapioca flour or quinoa flour, potato starch, or any other kind of flour that is not one of the 5 grains, and you mix it with water, you even add yeast to it, and you make a dough from it, that dough is going to ferment. In chemical terms, it's going to ferment, but halachically, it's not considered chametz. Okay? So that is the sort of irony in chametz, that it's not exactly defined by chemistry. Fermentation does not adequately define chametz because there's different kinds of fermentation. The one that I just described of another kind of flour fermenting is not called chametz, it's called sirachon. There's 2 different kinds of fermentations in Chazal. One is called chimutz, which is halachically defined as chametz, and the second is called sirachon. I don't know why they call it sirachon, because it doesn't necessarily smell bad, but that's what it's called. It's called decay, a kind of a decaying in the medium. Another example of sirachon is if you take one of the 5 grains, the flours of one, even wheat flour, but instead of mixing it with water, you mix it with fruit juice, which is not water. Even if you add yeast to that and you make a dough, when that dough ferments, it's fermenting, it rises up, it looks like a regular dough that you're making bread from, but halachically that dough is not considered chametz, because it has to be the 5 grains combined with water for 18 minutes or more. That is the halachic definition of chametz.
What was the 5th grain? Shibboleth, Shual, or
Oh, well, there's a book by a professor in Bar Ilan. His name is Professor Zohar Amar. It's called Chameshet Minei Dagan. He did a doctoral thesis on defining the botanical strains of all the 5 grains. And he brings each one and he shows the different opinions of what oats is according to the Mefarshim and what rye is, etc. And oats is the least agreed upon grain. In other words, Shibolet Shual, the translation of Shibolet Shual in botanical Latin terms, is the least agreed upon. There's more different opinions regarding it. So if you look at his book, he makes a table of each one, and the table of Shibolet Shual with the different opinions is the longest table. It has about 7 or 8 different opinions what Shibolet Shual could possibly be in terms of strain of plant, the botanical plant. Today it's accepted that Shibolet Shual in colloquial Hebrew is called oats. But halachically speaking, if you want to be machmir, if you eat flour and bread made with any of those in the list of his table, they would possibly qualify as chametz as well.
Today, could you take potato starch?
Yes.
And mix it with yeast and milk? They do that?
So we'll get to that in a second. We'll get to that. Okay. From the bare bones halacha, it is possible. But we're going to get to the chumrot in a minute. We'll talk about chumrot in a minute, and we'll get to that issue in a second.
Is there yeast that's kosher with Pesach?
Yes.
Okay, well, we'll get to the inyan of yeast in a second. Don't worry. We'll get there.
I was shocked too.
Okay, so we have these 2 different kinds of chemical fermentation processes. One is called chimutz, and the other one is called sirachon. Chimutz is water and the 5 grains for 18 minutes and more, and that is halachically defined as chametz. So what many people have tried to do, including myself, is try to find chemical characteristics for the process of chametz that doesn't exist in other fermentation processes. For example, a chemical characteristic of the fermentation that would distinguish chimutz from sirachon. Okay? A lot of researchers have done this. One of the most well-known researchers in this field, his name is HaRav Shabtai Rappaport. He used to be the head of the Machon Limudei Kodesh in Bar Ilan University. There was a yeshiva gdola in Bar Ilan, and he was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Kollel in Bar Ilan. And his area of expertise is on chametz and all the various aspects of chametz. And I made his acquaintance when I was starting to do research into the lechem hapanim. And the reason I had to explore this is because the lechem hapanim is a unique kind of bread. It's a very unique kind of bread because we said that 99% of the bread in the Beis HaMikdash are different kind of matzahs, with the exception of 2. One was the Shtei HaLechem on Chag HaShavuot, and the second one was one of the Korban Todah breads, which I showed you in last week's Shiur. The lechem hapanim is a matzah by definition. It has no chametz in it. However, the thickness of the bread is 4 fingers high, 1 tefach in thickness. Before it is baked, when you roll out the dough and you put the dough in the pan, before you put it in the oven, the thickness of the dough is only 1 finger. And while it is baking, it has to expand in the oven during the bake to rise to the thickness of 4 fingers, which is 1 tefach. So the question is, how do you achieve that without making the bread chametz? And that is a really serious problem, because the most simple thing is to put yeast in it and let it rise and stick it in the oven and bake it. But obviously that is asur, because the lechem hapanim is a matzah. So Professor Amar did some research on this, and he came to the conclusion that instead of using yeast as a rising agent for the lechem hapanim, they used some other kind of rising agent. They used a chemical rising agent, which was basically baking soda. It's called neter in biblical Hebrew, neter or natran in modern Hebrew. It was a compound that existed in biblical times. If you remember the story of the Sarah Ofim and the Sarah Mashkim in the time of Paro, that they were both imprisoned. Why was the Sarah Ofim imprisoned? Because Paro found a little stone in his bread, right? That is the midrash. So what was the stone? According to the Sefer HaYashar, one of the Midrashim, this stone was an even neter, which means that the baker, the Sarah Ofim, while he was making the bread, he used some kind of rising agent in the bread, which was a sodium-based rising agent, but he didn't dissolve the thing properly, and there remained a tiny little stone in Paro's bread. And this was the stone that Paro found in the bread. So, according to Professor Amar, he had the theory that the agent used to make the bread rise, the lechem panim, was baking soda. When you take baking soda, it's a neat experiment if you do it at home. Take a little bit of baking soda and take a tiny bit of vinegar, put a bit of vinegar in a cup, and you drop a teaspoon of baking soda into this. It bubbles up and it erupts like a volcano. It's a great trick to play with the grandchildren when they come over to emulate a volcano. Okay? So what happens is when the sodium bicarbonate reacts with the acidic agent like vinegar, which is called acetic acid, it creates a chemical reaction, one of the byproducts of which is carbon dioxide, the bubbles of carbon dioxide. It bubbles up and it fills whatever you are baking with air. That is the way a lot of people bake cakes today. They use baking powder or baking soda to bake cakes because it aerates the mixture of the cake or the cookies or whatever you're baking. So according to Professor Amar, his theory was that the way they made the lechem panim rise up to the thickness of a tefach was using baking soda. So as a starting point, what we try to do in our research is to reproduce Professor Zohar Amar's experiment and see how thick we could get the bread to rise using baking soda. If you flip over onto the next page, you'll see we did a whole series of experiments. First of all, we try to see what thickness the bread would rise to without adding anything. That would be the baseline. If you just take the flour and the water and the salt and you mix it in the dough and you stick it in the oven, is the bread going to rise at all or not? So that was the first experiment. It did rise fractionally because any dough, even if it has no rising agents, has air bubbles in which expand during the bake. So it fractionally rose a tiny little bit more than a finger, but that was it. It didn't rise anywhere close to 4 fingers high. The next experiment we did was trying to reproduce Professor Amar's experiment, baking with baking soda and vinegar. And the result of this experiment is that the bread rose double the original height of the dough. And instead of 1 finger, it rose to 2 fingers in height. And we couldn't get it past 2 fingers. And the reason for that is because as soon as the vinegar and the baking soda combine, they bubble up furiously. But in order to combine them into the dough, you need to knead the dough. And while you're kneading the dough, it pops all the bubbles that you've created, and it deflates a lot of the bubbles which are created by the baking soda. So while it does aerate the dough to some degree, it still does not result in the desired effect. So we had to find another way to inflate the dough to 4 fingers in height without deflating the bubbles. So there's a lot of technical, modern, high-tech ways of pumping a dough full of air. One of them is called the Chorley wood bread process, which is using a high-powered mixer to mix the dough under a vacuum. They pressurize the dough in the mixer under a vacuum, and they intensely knead the dough. They do this in many of the main enormous chain bakeries, and they do it under pressure. And after the kneading process, they release the pressure, and because of the release of the pressure, it inflates the dough almost instantaneously, which makes their production line go a lot quicker. They don't need to wait for the yeast to rise. They add yeast as well, but it accelerates the rising process, which shortens the bread production time, which means they can churn out a lot more bread in a much shorter time. So that is one of the ways to aerate bread very quickly without making it chametz. But obviously, in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, they didn't have the Chorley wood bread process. They didn't have vacuums, and they didn't have electricity, etc. So although that the head of Machon HaMikdash, he's of the opinion that when the third Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt, that we will be able to use the modern technology to do all the different things in the Beit HaMikdash. That's his opinion. But for sure, in the time of the second and the first Beit HaMikdash in the Mishkan, they never had this technology. So the question is, how did they do it without this technology? Another method to inflate the dough is to use something called double action baking powder. Double action baking powder is a special kind of baking powder that does not react immediately in the dough. It only reacts when it is heated in the oven. So you can mix the acetic acid and the double action baking powder, and it doesn't start bubbling up yet. Then you put it into the oven, and only when it gets heated does the chemical reaction begin, and that fills it up, and it actually gets to 4 fingers in height. But again, double action baking powder was only invented around the turn of the 1900s. They didn't have it 2,000 years ago. So we were trying to reverse engineer how they did it in the time of the Beit HaMikdash. And we came to the conclusion that the only way to make the bread rise is to use a kind of a fermentation process that instead of deflating the bubbles when you need them, that the bubbles actually increase exponentially because of the organisms in the dough making the bubbles and increasing the bubbles. The problem was, how do you do this without letting the dough become chametz? And that was the dilemma. How do we do this? It wasn't really much of a chemical issue. It was much more of a halachic issue. How do you do such a process without allowing the dough to become chametz? So I needed to get Urim V'Tumim, an expert on the halacha of chametz. So I approached HaRav Rappaport in Bar Ilan, and we began a journey on a series of experimentations, trying to define all different kinds of characteristics of the sirachon fermentation process and how it affects the dough. How we could make a sirachon fermentation in the lechem hapanim without making it chametz. So the first thing we needed to do was to define which flour. You're not allowed to use the 5 species of grain because that is considered as chametz. We wanted to use a different kind of flour which wouldn't be considered chametz. So we used all different. If you look at the table at the bottom, the graph at the bottom of the page, you'll see we did an experiment using all the different kinds of 5 grains. We used potato flour, quinoa flour, rice flour, cornstarch, matzah flour, all different kinds of things to try. I'll get to matzah flour in a second. And the purpose of this experiment was to see which one fermented the most, what was most active, the fermentation. And not surprisingly, the one that fermented the most was wheat. Wheat combined with water fermented the most. It created the highest rising dough. The one that was the least performance was the tapioca starch. Tapioca starch, it's pure starch, and it didn't ferment at all, kimat. And the reason for that is because the starch has no enzymes in it. It's a pure starch. They distill it that has no enzymes in, as opposed to wheat flour, which has enzymes in the flour, which allow the yeast to break the starch molecules into glucose, which is needed for the fermentation. The starch didn't have these enzymes, so it was just pure starch. The yeast couldn't eat the starch, so they couldn't ferment on the starch. That's why it performed the least well. So, as you can see, the 5 grains, as you go down from wheat, spelt, rye, barley, and oats, they decrease as you get to oats, which is the least risen dough. And the reason for that is because these 5 grains all contain gluten. They all contain gluten in reduced quantities. The wheat has the most gluten, and oats has the least gluten on the other side. So the wheat rises the highest because the gluten keeps the shape of the dough, and without gluten it doesn't keep the shape, so when it rises it deflates. That was the oats. So that was an interesting experiment to show also the properties of the different flours with the gluten in them. But we came to the conclusion that all the starches, like potato starch, quinoa flour, rice flour, they performed very badly. They weren't sufficient to inflate the dough to 4 fingers high. So then Rav Rappaport suggested that we try using matzah flour as the base of the flour. Matzah meal comes from wheat. Yes, it does come from wheat. However, once you have baked matzah flour, the matzah flour after it is baked, or the matzah after it is baked, according to the halacha, cannot become chametz. If you add water to matzah after it is baked, it cannot become chametz. Even if you soak matzah, kasher pesach matzah, if you soak it in water for 3 hours, it does not become chametz. Why? We'll talk about gebrochs in a second. So according to the bare bones halacha, matzah that is already baked cannot become chametz again. Once it's already been heated and all the proteins and gluten, etc., has been degenerated in the dough, it cannot become chametz. What is gebrochs? Gebrochs is a chumrah. Why is the issue of gebrochs? Because some people say that there may be a tiny fraction of flour in the matzah that was not fully baked, and because of the chashash of that tiny little minute portion of flour in the matzah, if that comes into contact with water, there's a chashash that will become chametz. Okay? So that's why certain minhagim, especially the Hasidic hashkafot, have a minhag of gebrochs where they don't mix matzah with any liquid whatsoever because of the chashash that will become chametz. However, the halacha says that if the matzah was baked fully, and you know for 100% sure that it was completely baked fully throughout, and there's no empty flour inside that was not baked, for 100% sure that matzah can no longer become chametz.
How would you know?
That's halacha. That's halacha.
How would you know it was 100% baked?
How would you know?
That's why they have to wax in there. How would you know?
How would you know? So that is the difference in minhagim and the halachot according to the different people. Some say that when the matzah is in a very hot oven for a certain amount of time, that is sufficient to dispel any doubts. And some people say we want to be machmir just in case. There's something called ridiyatapat. Ridiyatapat means taking the bread out of the oven. This is one of the most skillful jobs of making matzah, is knowing when to take the matzah out of the oven. You don't want to leave it for too long, otherwise it gets burnt. And you don't want to take it out too quickly because it may not be fully baked. So according to the Mefarshim, they say that ridiyatapat is an art that has been lost. They used to know how to do it in the time of the Gemara, but over the centuries, that art of ridiyatapat has been lost, so we don't know how to do it today. But according to most of the poskim say that the way we make matzah today for Pesach is sufficient to dispel any doubts. There are people who add chumrot to that and do gebrochs. But by definition, if you knew for sure that matzah was fully baked, then that matzah can no longer become chametz by definition. Okay? So that is why Rav Rappaport suggested that we use wheat flour, which has already been baked into matzah, and we grind it up, the matzah, into very fine matzah flour, and we use that to make a kind of a sourdough. We mix it with water, and just the way you make normal sourdough, you allow it to ferment over 3 or 4 days. You allow it to become filled with natural yeast and natural bacteria. That is called a sirachon, and it's not called chimutz. According to the halacha, it's a fermentation by chemical definition, but according to halachic definition, it's called a sirachon, and it's not called chimutz. And we tried using matzah flour, and the performance of matzah flour was a little bit less than pure wheat flour, raw wheat flour, but it was very close to rye flour in performance, which was sufficient to aerate the dough to get to the thickness of 4 fingers. So we made a sirachon fermentation using matzah flour. Until now, everything was okay. No questions asked about the chametz. The question is now, when you add this sirachon fermentation to the flour and the water of the lechem hapanim. The lechem hapanim has its own flour and it has its own water, and you've got to mix this together with a sirachon fermentation. You don't want the mixture of the lechem hapanim dough to become chametz, because that has wheat semolina in it. That is raw wheat semolina. It's not matzah that's been baked. It's raw wheat semolina. So you need to find a way to determine the point when the dough of the lechem hapanim becomes chametz from this matzah flour fermentation. And that was the main experiment that we did. If you look on the next page, Nisbach Arba, aeration of a showbread using a sirachon fermentation based on matzah flour. So Rav Rappaport is married to the granddaughter of Rav Moshe Feinstein. So he's very into Rav Moshe Feinstein's Sfarim. So a lot of his halachic definitions came from Igrot Moshe, which is one of Rav Moshe Feinstein Shlita's Zatzal's main works of halacha. And the way Rav Moshe Feinstein says, how do you determine when a bread has become chametz? according to his definition, it is that you notice an improvement in the taste of the bread. If you taste the bread compared to a bread that has not become chametz, if you notice an improvement in the taste of the bread, in the texture and the flavor of the bread, that is enough of a yardstick to determine that the bread has become chametz. That is Rav Moshe Feinstein's definition of the threshold between a non-chametz bread and a chametz bread. Obviously, if you could see the cracks and the silvery thing on the top, like it says in the Mishnah, you wouldn't need to do this. But we're talking about fermentation for about 10 or 15 minutes, and in this short time, there's no way you're going to get to the stage of the cracks and the silvery sheen. So we don't have another way to do it. We have to use Rav Moshe's yardstick, and that is what we based our experiment on. We took a dough, we made a dough, which we split up into 5 or 6 different pieces. How many pieces did we do? 7 pieces. We divided this dough into 7 pieces. The same dough was mixed at exactly the same time. We divided it into 7 separate pieces. The first piece, after it was kneaded, we immediately put it into the oven to bake. There was not a second's delay between the mixing of the dough and the baking. There was no time for the bread to become chametz. So that bread, the first piece, was 100% sure not chametz. That was the bread that we used as our baseline. That was the bread that everything else was compared to. This was the bread we're going to taste, what a bread that is not chametz tastes like, and then we're going to compare it to all the others which are chametz and see if they taste the same as the first bread. The other 6 pieces we baked at 5-minute intervals. So 5 minutes later we baked the second piece, another 5 minutes, the third piece, the fourth piece, etc. So each piece fermented for 5 minutes more than the previous one, and we baked breads with each of these pieces that fermented at 5-minute intervals, and then we compared each of these breads that had fermented for more 5 minutes or more to the original bread, which is our baseline bread. And we came to an interesting discovery that until, if you look at the page number Kuf Tzadi Daled, which is got a table and a graph at the bottom, it says portion B was baked at T 5 minutes, portion C was baked at 10 minutes, portion D at 15 minutes, etc. Each one was baked at a different time, and below that you see what thickness the bread was baked to, what thickness it achieved when it was baked to. And on the following page, Kuf Tzadi Hey, we have a table determining if there was any noticeable difference in taste between each of the pieces of the bread baked at different times compared to bread A, which was the non-chametz piece of bread. So 5, 10, and 15 minutes, when we compared those 3 pieces, you couldn't notice any difference in taste between those and the non-chametz bread. However, from 20 minutes and more, the bread baked number E at 20 minutes, it was uncertain. It was something there you couldn't be 100% sure whether it was different or not. Bread baked at 25 minutes was also not 100% certain, but the bread baked at 30 minutes, the taste was already noticeable, that you could taste a difference in taste compared to the non-chametz bread. Now, I asked HaRav Shabtai, how do you determine the taste? Who is the person who needs to determine this? Is this a Rav or another somebody? So he said the person to determine the difference in taste is an expert in bread, a baker. Just like a person who makes wine is an expert in how the wine tastes. So the person who's most expert in the flavor of bread is a baker. So he said, I'm the best person to determine this, not a Rav Posek. The person who is most expert to determine is an expert baker. So what we noticed is that the bread, which had a noticeable change in flavor, bread number G, that piece called piece number G, the difference in taste between that bread and the original piece, which was baked immediately, which was not chametz, there were 2 things that were different about it. First of all, there was a little bit of a sourness. There was a tiny acidity to the bread. And the second thing that we noticed is that bread was fractionally sweeter than the chametz bread. It was very, very slight, but it was the non-chametz bread had no sweetness and no acidity. But the piece that was noticeably different had a noticeable acidity to it. but it had also a tiny fractional increase in sweetness to it. Now, the acidity is very easily understandable because when bread ferments using yeast and bacteria, one of the byproducts of the fermentation process is acids, acetic acid, lactic acid, which increases the acidity in the bread. That's why bread has its characteristic sour flavor. Even bread using regular yeast has a kind of a sour tang to it because of the fermentation of the yeast. However, the surprising thing here was the sweetness that was added to a bread which has become chametz. That wasn't intuitive. Nobody would think that a bread that becomes chametz has added sweetness to it. So we tried to figure out why that was occurring in the dough. And we came to the conclusion that when you have flour, flour consists of starch, basically. It's molecules of starch, which is a long chain of glucose molecules all bonded together in a long chain. And the yeast cannot eat pure starch. Only thing that yeast can eat is glucose molecules. They can only eat basic sugars called glucose. So what the yeast does, it breaks the chains of the glucose molecules using an enzyme. It breaks the starch chain into glucose molecules. Then it has a fortune of glucose molecules which it starts eating and fermenting. Starch has zero sweetness. If you take cornstarch and you take a teaspoon of cornstarch and you taste it, it doesn't taste sweet at all because starch has no sweetness. However, glucose is much sweeter than starch. When the yeasts start breaking down the starch into glucose molecules, it increases the sweetness. It's very fractional, but it's noticeable to somebody who understands the flavor of bread. So this was a very interesting discovery because it was an additional marker, an additional chemical marker that could possibly be used to determine the stage where bread becomes chametz. Until now, the yardstick is the Chazal yardstick that you see the characteristics, or the Zman Hiluch Mil, but this is already the beginnings of some chemical definition that you can test the sweetness in it. There's a special scale used by scientists to test sweetness. It's called the BRIX, B-R-I-X scale. There's even technical equipment that you can use to measure this. So you could possibly measure the point when the BRIX level in the dough increases. That could possibly be used as a scientific way to determine when chametz actually starts taking place. So that was a very interesting discovery. But basically what we found is that the scientific results of this experiment correlate 1-to-1 with the Gemara and the Mishnah. When the Gemara and the Mishnah say that the time that the bread takes to become chametz is zman hiluch mil, it's talking about 18 minutes, that is exactly the time frame of this experiment. After 18 minutes, that is exactly when the bread starts becoming chametz from an experimentation point of view. So that was very, very interesting and very heartwarming as well to know that Chazal already thousands of years ago knew more than the scientists today know. They knew it without all the different technology. And obviously the result of this experiment was that we have to use the sirachon fermentation in the lechem hapanim dough. You're not allowed to wait longer than 10 to 15 minutes before it has to go into the oven. That was the basic point of this experiment, to how long you can leave this dough before it has to be put into the oven. And the time limit was 15 minutes. So what we do now is when we bake the lechem hapanim, we put the sirachon, we mix it in together with the dough. While it's being kneaded, it doesn't become chametz. From the second that it stops being kneaded, you have to get that dough into the oven within 15 minutes. And within those 15 minutes, the fermentation from the sirachon has enough time to create enough air bubbles in the dough to inflate the dough to 4 fingers in height, but it doesn't make it halachically chametz. So this was a very groundbreaking experiment, because by doing so we managed to get the lechem hapanim to rise to its full height without using any modern technology, without making it chametz. Yes?
So if you have up to 15 minutes to get it into the oven, that means you only have 3 more minutes to bake it?
Yes, so the oven is a very high temperature oven. It's about 350 degrees Celsius. So once it's in the oven, basically the timer stops. From the minute it gets into the oven, already it heats up to the internal temperature already by 3 minutes after that. it's not fully baked 3 minutes after that. It takes a little bit longer for the starch to gelatinize, etc. But all the living organisms are killed within 3 minutes. So that was a very interesting experiment, and the purpose of this was just to give you a little bit of an insight to some of the research that is taking place in the tchum of the Mikdash. It's not just philosophical, it's also very down to earth and very scientific in a lot of the tchumim that they are doing. That was just to give you a little bit of an insight into that. Now, the difference between Chametz in the Beit HaMikdash and the Chametz on Pesach, there is a difference. It's not the same Chametz, it's not the same halachot for Pesach as there are in the Beit HaMikdash. Although it says you are not allowed to have Chametz in the Lechem HaPanim, the halachic definition of Chametz in the Beit HaMikdash and in the matzot for Pesach are two separate sets of halachot. And the reason for that is basically because in the Beit HaMikdash, the people baking the breads were expert bakers. They were the Levi'im or the Kohanim baking the breads. And the Gemara says they were zrizim. What does zrizim mean? Not that they were running from one end very quickly from one side of the bakery to the other. Zrizim means that they were very baki in the halachot. They were very well versed in the halachot. They knew exactly the halachot of chametz, and they were very makpid that the bread would not become chametz. They were expert. Zrizim b'mitzvot, not in there running around. That is in the Beis HaMikdash. On the other hand, when you're baking chametz for Pesach until about 200 years ago, chametz was baked in a person's home until the industrialization of matzah around the beginning of the 1800s. Everybody baked matzah in their own homes. It was baked by housewives in their own home. Later on, in later generations, when the people forgot the art of baking matzah, so they would take their flour and go to the local rabbi and bake it with the local rabbi. It would be a mashgiach. But 600-700 years ago, people were well enough versed in the art of baking matzah that each woman at home would bake matzah in their own home. In fact, the Teimanim, before they made Aliyah to Eretz Israel, they used to bake matzah in their own homes. I'm sure you can ask Arya. He may remember from his parents.
My grandmother still bakes it. They work with her and they bake it on the temple.
The Teimanim and the Ethiopians, when they make matzah, they don't do it anymore because the Ashkenazi rabbis don't allow them to. They used to bake matzah fresh every day during Pesach. So their matzot were very soft and flexible like a lafa, not like a hard cracker like matzah. So it didn't remain fresh for more than a day. They had to bake it every day fresh. But here in Eretz Israel, they don't allow them to do that. They don't want a chashash, the Rabbanut HaRashit as a chashash that the people baking it at home, if something goes wrong, then they'll have chametz in their home, and that is an isur karet, which is a very serious isur. So they don't want to get to that situation. So what they do is they make all the Sfaradim matzot before Pesach. They bake them all, and they freeze them. And the Sfaradim who buy the matzot buy it frozen, and when you defrost it, it's fresh. So it's all baked before Pesach, and there's no chashash of baking on Pesach. The whole process of chametz and Pesach in the last 1,000 years is a series of chumrot added one on top of the other. And the matzot that we eat today for Pesach bear very little resemblance to the matzot that they had in the Beis HaMikdash because of the chashash of chimutz. The isur of chametz in Pesach is a serious isur. It's karet. It's much less of an isur. It's much more severe an isur than having to go and spend a little bit more money to buy chametz, which for 100% sure is not chametz. So chisaron kis is not a consideration. So the different generations of poskim added chumrot one on top of the other. For example, they reduced the water content in the matzah. Until about 700 years ago, the matzot were all soft matzahs, but they said that the softer the matzah is, the longer it takes to bake, and if you don't bake it long enough, it doesn't fully bake through. So they reduced the water content in the matzah gradually. That is why the matzah that Ashkenazim eat today on Pesach has very little water content, because it's a chumrah al gabe chumrah al gabe chumrah. And I want to emphasize that we don't have any option today. We have to follow the poskim to the letter. Every chumrah and every minhag, whatever the poskim say, there's no way to la'ar'er it. We have to accept it. Ketorah leMoshe miSinai, and there's no way lehakel. That is written in stone. That can't be changed. Even though it may not resemble hopefully when the Beis HaMikdash is rebuilt and the Mashiach comes and he reveals to us all of these secrets that they use in the Beit HaMikdash, we will reacquire the knowledge that they had back then, and then maybe we can think about cancelling any of these chumrot. But until then, obviously, we cannot do that. When you ask the question about yeast, is yeast chametz, can it be used on Pesach? The answer is that yeast on its own is not chametz. That's an enormous paradox, because the thing that makes the bread ferment, which is yeast, itself is not chametz. It cannot be chametz because yeast is a natural living cell. Every time you take a breath of air, you breathe in a few 100,000 yeast cells. You just don't see them because they're microscopic. So if yeast itself was chametz, you wouldn't be allowed to breathe on Pesach. Okay, so it's a bit of a problem. So yeast itself is not chametz, it's a living organism. However, when it comes into contact with the bread and the flour and the water, it results in chametz. So yeast on its own, the question you asked, can yeast be used on Pesach with potato flour? The answer is no. Because they don't want yeast in the home on Pesach, because there's a chashash that it may mitgalgel to something that could become chametz, and we don't want to get into those areas, so we make a chumrah that yeast is persona non grata in the home on Pesach completely. Although we do use baking powder, for a lot of people use those who don't follow gebruchs use baking powder to make cakes and cookies, etc., which is not yeast. Okay, basically that was the section on the chemistry part of chametz. What I want to do now is in the last 5-10 minutes is I want to wrap up the whole series of Shiurim and tie everything together. So chametz is not a chemical process. Chametz is a philosophical concept. And we started exploring this in the first shiur on the Chet Adam HaRishon. And we said that chametz is a pause. It's a rest in activity. In other words, you doing something and you take a break, and while you take a break, in that time, something happens in your absence. You create a vacuum, and vacuums cannot exist in nature. They have to be filled by something. And if you take a break, for example, when you make a dough and you go and have a cup of coffee, the dough does not remain as it was before you went for the cup of coffee. Something happens in that gap. Something happens in that vacuum. It is filled by organisms. It's filled with yeasts and natural bacteria, and it begins a process of chametz. So the philosophical concept of chametz is basically don't take a vacation. That's basically what the Torah is saying to you. When you take a vacation, it's not taking a vacation from work. It's taking a vacation from the Torah and mitzvot. That's basically what it's saying. There is no vacation from Torah and mitzvot. You can take a vacation from work and go to the hotel and go to visit the seaside, but there is no break from Shmirat Torah and mitzvot. And when Adam HaRishon and Chava took a break from the Torah and mitzvot, that is when all the problems started. When Chava started making this bread, according to Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, that the Eitz Hadat was a Eitz Chita. She made a bread out of this Chita. She left it. It says, Hanachash hishiani va'ocher, according to sefer Meir Panim, Al tikra hishiani ela hishani. In other words, it was left to delay, and in this time, the Yetzer Hara stepped in and took control. Rachel asked me, she called me after the first shiur, she said, what is the root of the word chametz? Is it not from the word lehachmitz, hachmatzah? And that is exactly what chametz really is. It's not, chametz doesn't mean sour. It doesn't come from the root of chamutz. That's not the definition of chametz. Chametz comes from the root of the Hebrew word lehachmitz, which means to miss out on something. Lehachmitz, an opportunity. You have an opportunity now to do something, and you say, no, I'll do it in an hour's time, in 2 hours' time, tomorrow, next week, next year. That is called lehachmitz. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives you a mitzvah that you have the opportunity to mekayem, do not miss out on it. That is the philosophical concept of chametz. And what happened in Gan Eden is that Adam HaRishon, he chmitz at the opportunity. He had the opportunity to eat the fruit of the Etz Chaim, which was the same fruit as the man that Am Yisrael ate in the Midbar. It was called Lechem Abirim. It was a perfect food that you had to do nothing to prepare it. It was already made. You didn't have to invest any time and energy in making a bread and kneading the dough and grinding the flour and sifting the flour and winnowing and threshing and all these processes that are necessary. You just had to take it and eat it, just like Am Yisrael found the man in a cup at their doorstep every day in the Midbar. That's called man, it's called lechem haberim. That is the fruit of the Eitz HaChaim, and that is the fruit that Kadosh Baruch Hu told Adam HaRishon to eat from. But obviously Adam HaRishon did not eat from that, and that was the Chet Etz Hadat. And the whole thing began to mitgalgel over the generations, and the whole process that we are currently going through now is a tikkun for that original Chet. So the purpose of not eating Chametz on Pesach is that we said that Mitzrayim was considered the land of Chametz. Paro was the Gilgul of the Nachash from Gan Eden. It was a kapara for the Chet Adam HaRishon. The whole process of the Avot doing their own tikkunim, the Hafrashat Chala of the Imahot when they made their own dough in their own homes, the Matan Torah when HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Am Yisrael man, the process of the Korbanot in the Beit HaMikdash. All of this is a whole series of tikkunim to metaken the Chet of Adam HaRishon. The Lechem HaPanim is a part of this. It's a tikkun in its own way for the Chet Adam HaRishon. It's all to teach us one simple lesson. When you have an opportunity to perform a mitzvah, take it. Don't miss out on it. Lo lahachmitz et ha'izdamnut. That is the philosophical concept of Chametz. Be'ezrat Hashem, after 2 weeks' time is Purim. There's a halacha that on Purim, it's a minhag that on Purim you already start learning halachot for Pesach. So we were machmir we were mahadrin. We started learning already a few weeks before Purim. So Be'ezrat Hashem, we should all have a sameach and a froilich Purim and a chag kasher v'sameach on Pesach.